Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 7th, 2020. Happy Labor Day, everybody. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have a great interview. But before we dive into that, I do want to thank this week's top patrons of the show. Remember, if you want to pledge your support, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week, I want to thank Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, and Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa. Oh, wait, there's more. Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Robert Christ, or maybe it's Christ, I'm not sure. Welcome to the fold. Elise Christie. So many freaking awesome people here. I can't even read all of your names. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. You make Talk Nerdy possible week after week after week after week after week. All right, so this week I had the opportunity to chat with Thomas Kostigen. He is an award-winning journalist. He's written for a ton of platforms like the Washington Post, Discover, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal. He also founded the Climate Survivalist column for USA Today, and he's written 2 books for National Geographic on climate preparedness. His newest book is called Hacking Planet Earth: How Geoengineering Can Help Us Reimagine the Future. So yeah, let's learn about how to hack planet Earth. Without any further ado, here he is, Thomas M. Kostigen. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about your newest book, Hacking Planet Earth: How Geoengineering Can Help Us Reimagine the Future. I think that a lot of times when people hear the word geoengineering, or really, I think we see a similar problem in science communication when people hear about genetic engineering. Really, anytime that they think about human influence on what is quote unquote a natural process, they get a little bit anxious, or there's some apprehension around that. And so I'm actually really excited to kind of bust some myths, to talk about maybe where there are real ethical quandaries and where maybe the hype is what people are most worried about. But before I guess we get into all of the nitty-gritty, I think a good opener would just be like, what is geoengineering? Just as a concept or as a discipline, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up all those points right up top, because it is, a challenge to discuss geoengineering. And definitionally, geoengineering is the intentional manipulation, the large-scale manipulation of the climate by human means in order to thwart global warming or temperature rise. And that could entail, just to get granular and specific here, sunshades that will sit in outer space and deflect the sun. Or you could have autopiloted ships that are traversing the oceans and spraying seawater into the air to cool the marine layers and what lies underneath. Or lasers that can manipulate the weather. So things like that, those are like the top line headline ones, and hopefully we can sort of unpack those, because those are the far out reaches. And there's some analog versions of those as well. But that's basically what we're talking about, is, us stepping in to do what Mother Nature can no longer do because we've mucked up the planet.
Right. So it's sort of like we use the term geoengineering to talk about the mindful and intentional engineering processes that are, some of them are still theoretical, but some of them we're actively doing now. To basically undo the not so mindful, sort of passive and really detrimental, kind of like, I guess you wouldn't call it engineering, the destruction that we've done to the planet, because it wasn't intentional, but we really did engineer the planet unintentionally into a bad place. So now we want to engineer it into a place where it's at least somewhat mitigated, right?
Exactly. We just sort of went at things without any type of plan, and if that's hitting close to home with the current public health pandemic, there's a great parallel there. So yeah, there wasn't a plan for, okay, let's, use these fossil fuels that we found. And oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff, that's going up into the atmosphere, but let's not worry about that. Now we're worrying about it. So we have to do exactly what you said, which is engineer our way out of it.
Right. So, before we get into some of the technical aspects of that, I would love to talk to you more personally about how you kind of got into this field, because looking at your background and your work as a science journalist and an author, you've written several books. You've been really focusing on the climate beat for quite some time. What first brought you into this world?
Yeah, well, that's worth a story, I guess. And the story is I've done a lot of work, not only in print, but I've done some documentaries and I've done, a lot of work across different media. And I was asked, an age ago to go to Africa and revisit the We Are the World camps for a documentary. And it was Artists Against AIDS Worldwide, if you remember that movement. And I was in Ethiopia, and I was out in the middle of the desert, the middle of nowhere, and I was doing a stand-up by this dry riverbed, and just for a little bit of visuals there. And I noticed this dot of purple on the horizon that eventually got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it came to be about 4 feet tall. And it was a young woman, maybe 10 years old, girl, and she spoke in, the local language. And, I turned to my translator and, just being the jaded white man, said, "How much?" As awful as that sounds. And he said, "Actually, she doesn't want money. She wants a pencil. She wants a pencil so she could do her homework, and she has designs to be a doctor, and she wants to help the people in her village." And it's just like, whoa, like that overwhelming feeling of that little action can have such a domino effect in a positive way that I hadn't even imagined, right? And so I had been doing a lot of work in, like I said, writing for the media and for print and all sorts of stuff. And I said, I need to do something a little closer to home. I need to be able to provide and use what skills humbly that I have to give people some tactical measures, tactical opportunities that they can change the world in simple ways. So I went about writing a book called The Green Book. And fortunately, that was in 2007, when everyone was walking out of An Inconvenient Truth, the documentary by Al Gore, going, "Oh my God, now what do we do?" And I had hundreds of solutions as to simply what you could do, everyday steps that you can, make the planet a better place. And so that book did very well. And it got me on the path of thinking about sustainability in a very different way. And so the next book that I wrote was about, called You Are Here, what you can do to affect people, places, and things all over the world, and how they affect you back here in your home. And sort of, again, this kind of proverbial butterfly effect. And I've gone down this path for a number of years now, 13 years, and this is my 10th book. And after my last couple of books, I said, this really isn't working. The idea that we can just all have this epiphany that we are going to be more sustainable and change the world in a very limited period of time isn't working fast enough. So what else is out there that can speed things up? And I turned to geoengineering. And that's how this book came about.
And, it really speaks to something that I've been coming to grips with a little bit more recently in my science communication work, that, I remember watching this documentary. I think it was like a Frontline or maybe an American Experience or something. It was a PBS documentary about plastic recycling. and really basically the con that has been plastic recycling for so long, which is, this concerted effort by the plastics industry to sort of like make things seem more reusable than they are, to sort of move the burden and the onus to the consumer and away from the manufacturer. And I started to realize, I've slowly been coming to this for a while, that while individual action is fundamental, it's bedrock and it's so important, right? And we all need to be in this together, and we all need to be doing those individual things we can be doing to consume less and to be mindful of the consumption that we do have. It's not enough without government regulation, without big efforts. Like at this point, we can't recycle our way out of this problem. We have to do more than that. And I think that that's something that a lot of, movements or maybe articles or just conversations that I've had with people has shown me, like, I'm not sure that that is well accepted within society yet, that we need more concerted and organized action.
Yeah, and I would take it a step further. I think we need, private sector participation first and foremost, because, when we create a market for this type of change, that really speeds things up. If you look at just your smartphone and all the things that you rely on in your smartphone, and how much that's changed the way we go about our lives over the last 5 years, 10 years, pick your number. That's the type of expediency we need in the environmental space. And you do, to your point, have a lot of pushback by people who say, well, if we go there, then we're going to ignore everything else. We can't provide a market for the environment because, commercial interests are what got us into this to begin with. And so it's a really, difficult thing to get people out of that reptilian brain mentality of it's not just the thing in front of you. You have to have critical thinking here and be able to use both levers at the same time, which is science and innovation, as well as popular movements, in order to affect change. So that's, I think, what's needed, and you fall into that trap of, oh my God, geoengineering bad, recycling good, and it's not. It's both. So we do.
And also so much of that is marketing, right? Like so much of that is like a concerted kind of push over, at this point, I think, decades to put the onus on the individual and to like kind of curate or foster individual guilt and move some of that onus away from these more organized and, like you said, these private industry or these governmental industry actors. And I think that's what really is worrisome for me, is that the reason that we so clearly see that binary of geoengineering bad, recycling good, is because we've been sort of under the radar told that from all sides for so long. We just grew up with that mentality.
100%. I spent about an hour on the phone this morning with two scientists, climate scientists, and trying to get their messaging to actually make sense and to be clear and not to speak to academia and not to talk over people's heads and to actually have things embedded in what they were trying to say, which is based on fascinating science. I won't get into it here, but how do you translate that? And that's another component here, is that the science community, and I hate to say it, but has been really bad at communicating what climate change, global warming, temperature rise, it's starting to change, is, and how can we best message that? And that's been missing since the beginning on all of this. And the people that do have sophisticated, communications, they have stepped in, and now I'm talking about, the interests that are basically the energy sector and those types of actors. They have very sophisticated communication measures, and they can step in and change things in a very nuanced way, so that we think that recycling and plastics, the way we're doing it, the onus is on us, and oh my God, now we have to change things. Well, why? why isn't it on the manufacturer and the supplier? And sure, we can create demand, but that's a tricky thing. If you don't know what you're trying to create and you don't know what the product is that you're supposed to buy, how can you create demand in the marketplace? And so there needs to be a rethink and really a reset button on all of this. And geoengineering goes a long way to help us get to a point of, okay, let's buy some time with some things. It's not going to cure the cause of all of this, right? But it can buy us some time in getting to reduce temperature rise, in the short term. Otherwise, we're faced with a really difficult scenario of having to reduce global temperature rise by 50% by 2030. That's fast. And it hasn't happened in, 13 years. It hasn't happened in 20 years. Carbon emissions continue to creep up, and every single year. And, we may have a little bit of reprieve this year, but do we really need a pandemic or want a pandemic in order to get to that point? And that's
not a sustainable solution.
Well, let's not do this.
That's for sure.
Let's do this again.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where we think about, when I think of geoengineering on the whole, I think about it's a complicated issue, right? Because we're not just talking about carbon, or we're not just talking about methane, or we're not just talking about, ocean acidification, or all these different, pollution, all these different issues, and there's different tacks that we can take. And I'm excited to dive into some of those exciting options. But the idea here is that as opposed to taking my own personal contribution or emissions, problem and reducing it or mitigating it on a large scale, we're actually like what we should have been doing from the beginning is for every, pound of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, there was some sort of mitigation process built into the manufacture. But of course, we didn't do that. So now there's all this excess that even if we stop producing, or if we try to recapture what we have produced, we still have to clean up what's already there. And that's the part that's so complicated, right? Is how do we do not just enough to be neutral, but enough to be net kind of negative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really well put way of describing the situation we're in. I spoke with this scientist who has the best scientist name that I have run across, Klaus Wagner. Anyone named Klaus?
Klaus Wagner, I love it. Yeah, so good.
And he created an artificial tree that could bring us to negative emission type of processes. And he described it as, look, we've been just dumping our trash outside and on our neighbor's lawn for decades, right? And okay, we're going to stop, but that doesn't mean that trash goes away. We need to do something about that stuff that we just been leaving on the lawn for all these years. So how do we clean that up? And that's part of his thesis about how can we draw down carbon from the atmosphere in a way that makes sense and bring us back into so-called negative emission type of programs. So again, really fascinating scientists who started off thinking about, as I said, how did you start to think about creating an artificial tree? And he said, well, I was thinking about how robots could essentially procreate. So you got to explain that one for me, please.
Sure.
Yeah. And it was like, how can robots, replicate themselves so that they wouldn't have need for us anymore in this world that he was thinking of, because he is a robotics guy. And it turns out that, the one thing missing in, robots just taking over the planet, and I know we've gone way off course here, and getting rid of us humans, is that they can't figure out a way to make energy. So you still need a human touch for that. So that's what got him thinking about energy. And of course, carbon was a byproduct of that, and carbon budgets. And he said, well, oh my God, look at what we're doing. How can we fix that? And so he came up with this really cool, almost passive device called the artificial tree. And that will draw carbon out of the atmosphere at exponential rate of a traditional tree, and could bring us to kind of a carbon neutral scenario with a forest of them. So interesting things like that. I always love getting into the minds of scientists to figure out the light bulb moment, you know.
I love that you mentioned that because when I think about, technological advancements, or when I even think about some of these like theoretical kind of moonshot concepts, so much of it comes down to human psychology. And, one of the things that you touched on during that story was this idea of the human sort of concept of away. Like we throw things away as if they're going somewhere else. And I think that one of these mentality shifts that's so important, before probably on the whole people are supportive of large movements like geoengineering, or even before individual actors are willing to make massive lifestyle changes, is to zoom out to that, what astronauts call the cosmic perspective. Like, don't just think about what's behind the cabinet door in your kitchen, like the bin being some sort of magical digester, or the bin that you put on the street that just like the magical elves come in the middle of the night and then they like vaporize your trash. Like, that's not how this works. Like, away is just somewhere else that you can't see it anymore. It's still doing what it does.
Yeah, you're taking my Santa Claus away from me with all of those things there.
Right?
um, yes, and that's Bill McDonough does a brilliant job, with his cradle to cradle concept of that. There is no away and throw away. And, to take that concept to places that he's been working with, like Ford or others, of let's bake into this process the idea that this eventually is going to go out of use. So how can we repurpose this particular item, product, what have you, so that it's usable again, so that there truly is no away and throw away. And I think that's a really great concept. And if we could get manufacturers to start thinking about that in a different, and this is going to bring up something else, economic way, then I think, that's what we should be talking about. But again, we have to have a different lens on, economies and what really is capital, and how we can look at the lifespan of something and then use that. And that gets very, very complicated when it comes to economics,
Right. Calculating in all of those end costs that we don't usually think of when we think of a consumer product. That's just, I'm going to make it. This is how much it's worth to the user, and then all of its impacts on the environment, all of its downstream effects, we're just going to somehow pass those on to later generations. Like, they need to be built into the actual cost of the product.
Absolutely. And, look at solar. It's a great example of, how economies work, and especially economies of scale. And the price of solar and alternative energy is now in many places less than fossil fuels or even coal, which to date has been, the cheapest form of energy per kilowatt hour, at least, on the planet. And so now we have that benefit. If we can get those messages out there, then look, it's cheaper, right? And, people like cheap, goes back to that, cheap good type of, mentality. So, the more that we can do that, I think the more that people will buy into it and say, well, why would we want to do anything else? And, the next generation seems to get it from everybody I speak to, because not only are they going to bear the burden of things, they're also bearing the costs, the physical burden in terms of public health, et cetera, and, extreme weather events and all the things that, we know that could be, catastrophic, but also the economic burden. So the more that we can start fresh, tabula rasa, and put on the whiteboard things that, do come into play down the road, the proverbial down the road, I think that we could design, a much better future for us. I went to Masdar City in the UAE, which is the city of the future, designed by Norman Foster. And that's basically what he did. He looked at, the great architect, Norman Foster, and he thought, okay, let's just do this from scratch, the first off-grid city on the planet, and build everything with that type of consciousness in mind. And interestingly, he didn't just look at, what we might think of as futuristic type of solutions. He looked a lot at indigenous cultures and what they used in order to survive, let's say, extreme heat by placing or siting buildings closer to one another so there's more alleyways. And, you start to look at where you place things in accordance with the sun and how you can capture more wind and, fresh water ideas. And it's really fascinating that it's not just, or it doesn't have to be, these techno solutions. There are things that are much more analog that will do the job as well. And, if we can redefine what geoengineering is, which is what I try to do in the book, we can then embrace those types of innovation methodologies as well.
Right, because geoengineering is not so much about how futuristic or sophisticated the technology is to get the job done. It's really just about whether or not the idea or the process that you're implementing gets the job done. And so, of course, these low-tech solutions are going to make a lot of sense on a widespread scale. And then these more high-tech solutions are going to be necessary when necessary, especially if the cost involved or the political will that's required is sort of a more difficult sell. Obviously, if there are some, what we think of as just simple hacks, why aren't we doing them now? Why aren't we doing more of them? I guess we are, but that's what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about these different things. I mean, maybe we'll start with the moonshot ones because I think those are what are sexy and draw people in sometimes. Maybe we can start with some of the most kind of out there ideas that you've come across that are probably still in R&D, but could actually have a huge benefit.
Yeah, I mean, stratospheric aerosol injection, mouthful there. That's probably the one that gets the most press, which is spraying different types of aerosols, particles, into the stratosphere, into clouds. And therefore, at the highest level of the cloud, at the shelf, you would have these reflective materials, and that would bounce sun's radiation back into outer space and therefore cool what's below, and what's below is us. So if we could do that, the idea is that we will be able to at least buy some time by lowering the global temperature. And this is being experimented by, famously Harvard professor David Keith and some others. There's, a lot of discussion around this because it is effective, but there's also the consequences, and we're still studying, or they're still studying what those consequences might be, whether that would create, wacko weather scenarios in certain parts of the planet and redistribution of total radiation from the sun would affect some places more than others, and what do those things look like? So that's the one that gets the most fanfare. That people have very, very strong opinions on both sides of that, and that's one that I think is worth maybe unpacking a little bit, because there's different variants of that gets into creating a higher albedo. The albedo effect is how bright a surface is and can bounce the sun rays back into outer space and therefore cool things. The lower the albedo, it's a darker surface and it holds on to the heat, much like wearing a dark t-shirt on a summer day. So that is the one that gets a lot of talk because it's close to being put into practice. I must say it's not just on the theoretical side anymore.
All right, everyone, let's get back to the show. Yeah, I mean, it sounds doable, but it also sounds like what you said about the potential to just redistribute. It's kind of like what good is my umbrella if it makes it rain harder on the guy next door? That wouldn't be fun. So is that a real consideration? Like, are there real risks around uh, spraying these aerosols into clouds in certain regions and it having actually just a negative effect in other regions?
Well, that is 100% for sure consequence. So,
okay, yeah, that seems like it's a net neutral gain then to me. Maybe I'm wrong.
Depends on what scale you do it at. And this is the
Okay.
where we have to get into the critical brain, right? Because you go, okay, if we were to do it at scale just to create a carbon neutral world, then certainly people will die as a consequence of this. There might be wildfires in the Amazon because it will dry out. There might be, extreme storms in, the tropics because of this. And they're weighing all of these considerations. But if you did it at a margin of scale, there in turn, the margin of consequence is lowered. So if it was combined or compiled with another form of, mitigation, then we could then get to a scale that's reasonable. So that's what's being bantered about. And I must say, this is the one thing that I think people always forget in this equation. No one is talking about just going out and doing this recklessly. There are, there's a lot of people, millions of people around the world that sit in front of a square screen with a weird headset on and a microphone and glasses. And they pretend.
Are you talking about me right now?
I didn't want to get personal, but
I'm like, I'm glad there's not a mirror in my studio.
But you can enter a different world and really feel like you're in a different world with virtual reality. And
right.
The same type of modeling and technology exists. So we don't have to just go, okay, let's send, someone up into the clouds and spray some stuff into there and see what happens. It's not like that. So there's a lot of modeling taking place, a lot of variables. And as we know, computers, especially supercomputers, can do incredible calculations to give you a really good idea of what might occur. So should there be an ethical body studying this? Of course. Should there be an oversight committee? Of course. And there is. There's one at the UN, and there's some even on the state level, believe it or not, in the United States, to examine geoengineering possibilities. So those are the types of things, you just have to take into account a lot of, checks and balances. And I must say, all the people that I spoke to in the book, they're all real scientists. And I do get into some of the wacky stuff, but that's only to bring up the point of, this is out there on the spectrum. Let's bring it back and see what some of these other things are. So an example of like an analog version of what I just described is painting roofs and roads lighter colors.
Yeah. And isn't that mandated in Los Angeles to have a light roof?
It is. Any new development is. That is correct. And they're building the largest neighborhood in Canoga Park, may be the model for the United States. Who would have thought? You and I both know what Canoga Park is, but it's a residential, for other listeners, it's a residential area that's kind of outside the boundaries of what we call LA proper. And that neighborhood is being eyed as being the first kind of cool roof, cool road neighborhood in the country. So, and it's a very simple design. If you go to Greece, you go to the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, you see that, not everything is a dark color. The houses are white. It's so people have thought about this for centuries, and we're just now starting to figure it out here.
And it also speaks to, not only is it a really kind of simple, analog, low-tech solution that is analogous to exactly what you're talking about, like increasing the albedo, making the sun reflect back instead of just soaking in. It also speaks to the really important parallel, I think, between social justice and environmental justice, which of course is becoming more and more on the tips of people's tongues as they are educating themselves finally, about the Black Lives Matter movement and about Indigenous rights. And I think people are starting to become a little bit more aware of the inequities when we talk about these catastrophic climate problems, of course, they disproportionately harm people of color, people in kind of lower SESs, the sort of permanent underclass that Michelle Alexander talks about in The New Jim Crow. And I think one of the really interesting things, I have a friend named Nick Cha Kim, who I used to work with at SoCal Connected, which was a TV show at KCET, our local PBS affiliate here in LA. And he did a beautiful story about tree cover in LA. I think it won some awards, where you can look in your city and map out where is there more blacktop and where are there more trees. And the blacktop's in the poor neighborhoods and the trees are in the rich neighborhoods. And these are just raw realities of many urban areas across the globe where simple city planning changes could have an incredible effect on climate change.
And you're absolutely right. It's and the New York City Department of Public Health did a really interesting map of dark areas in the city, income and heat issues, and when it comes to public health. And it was just astounding, to see where that occurred. And as you pointed out, it's, low income or disenfranchised communities who don't have, the wherewithal to keep tree cover or keep things nice and pretty and, all that. So where is government there? And how are we looking at, the inequities of not only climate change, but, some of these other issues? Because when you start to talk about an increased heat scenario, we know from numerous studies throughout, hundreds of years that causes, other types of issues. Wars have been created on, increased heat scenarios. There's an increased chance for conflict, so you start to see how this could play out in a very negative way, aside from, the environmental issues into, other social areas as well. So it's important to keep that in mind. And for what seems like a very simple fix, or solution, it's worth just bringing that up and putting it in headlights. And there's a few of those around.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk about the idea of disenfranchised individuals being disproportionately harmed by something as simple as living in a hotter neighborhood. And so you take that idea of negative public health consequences, more hospital visits, maybe lower nutrition, all of these things combined on the one hand, and that's already terrible. But take it to extreme, like you mentioned, we're talking about a crisis of epic proportions that I think a lot of people aren't ready to face. Just the number of, for example, climate refugees that we're going to be seeing in the near future, that we're already starting to see. Or, like you said, these massive geopolitical conflicts. We've seen wars over oil. We're going to start seeing wars over water. We're going to start seeing, really exacerbated, I guess you could say, tribalistic conflict, because there's going to be fights over resources and who should have those resources. Is it my people or is it your people? And I think that, it seems so simple, but how are we going to be fighting or mitigating these problems when we're also dealing with, the global pandemics and the wildfires and the geopolitical conflicts and the influx of displaced people? These are huge issues, and issues wherein people will die. And that's the part and they are dying already. And that's the part that makes me so, I don't know if excited can't be the right word, but hopeful that some of these big picture ideas can be implemented safely and implemented quickly, because we don't have time, do we?
No, and that's the parallels are pretty much astounding. But it's also worth noting that we have a public health crisis facing us today, where if we don't do the right thing, we have the chance of dying. That's how severe it is. right? You don't wear a mask, you don't social distance. The chance there is that you will die. Now, we don't have a vaccine and we don't have treatments, right? But we've, for the large part, tried to do some of these things, and some people just refuse to do it. Now, take that out to climate change, where the ramifications or the consequences aren't as severe in the short term, right?
Right. It's harder to see them.
How do you see that? How do you, and if we can't get people to do the right thing with a pandemic, my God, the challenge for climate change is so much greater. So we have to have some really, really salient solutions. We have to have some ideas as to what's going to matter and how that's going to stick. And it's across the board of not only here in the United States that we got to be thinking about this, but we have to be thinking about this regionally on a geopolitical arena as well, and have that discussion. And to date, again, if you look at IPCC stuff and, all the research that comes out of that, it's highly academic and it's highly targeted toward, a lot of agencies and governments where this gets built into a bureaucratic, treaty, and everybody agrees on it, and then nobody abides by it, or very few.
Right, because there's no enforcement. It's like, sure, I'll shake your hand on this. Like, what? We got to do better.
We got to reboot and rethink this all with multiple and multifaceted constituencies represented. And that includes, developing nations as well as developed nations. It includes local governments and as well as big federal governments. So how can we, create this chain of best practices globally? And that's, I think, what's needed. And then can we arm that committee, this imagined cooperative of doing, all do-gooders who have the right idea in mind, with solutions that are both near-term, medium-term, and long-term, so that we have some time in order to build up to capacity, so that we have some time where things like solar and alternative energy have a chance to replace, what we have today. And, we're not going to remove every gas-powered car on the planet tomorrow. That's just a fact. So what do we do in the meantime?
Right. And also, yeah, and how do we think about the downstream effects? Sometimes I think it's hard as an individual consumer because it feels a little like we're operating with some black boxes in front of us. I've been driving electric for about almost 10 years now. And it's just my lifestyle. I can't remember the last time I went to a gas station, but I still have to be mindful of the fact that my car is powered, and that power, a certain percentage of it is still coming from coal, or at least in LA, natural gas. It's not 100% clean energy. And so, what can I do? Can I get solar panels on my roof? Well, I live in kind of a condo, so my roof isn't very big. And, I'm always trying to think of all of these ways that at least my footprint can be made as small as possible. But again, like we were discussing, when we talk about geoengineering, this idea of like really hacking the planet, what we're talking about are bigger solutions, not always more technologically fancy solutions, but just bigger solutions that affect whole communities, or even, large swaths of the planet. So we talked a little bit about these aerosols that introduce also a real ethical, like almost a trolley problem, the philosophical ethical quandary there. What are some of the other kind of large scale solutions that you cover in the book that maybe I could ask this way? Which ones do you find yourself most enamored with? Which ones do you feel like, oh man, if we had the political will, this could really work? Like, it doesn't have much of a downside. It's something that I think we should be really seriously considering.
Yeah, well, I look at, everybody goes to, and great question, because, everybody starts to think about energy, carbon emissions, energy, fossil fuels. But food is a huge contributor to the climate problem. And the top 5 food companies now emit more carbon emissions than BP or Exxon or Shell, any of those. And so there's a real interesting idea behind what can we do with our food chain, which maybe even more, closer to people's hearts and minds because it's their stomachs. What can we do to shift that, market towards something that's more sustainable? And then you can start to get into some really interesting ideas around smart soils, which are different ways to farm as opposed to just, monoculture, commercial farming, cropping, which degrades the soil, which uses fertilizers, which of course have a lot of, petroleum in them as well. And is there a way that we can then do better with innovative farming methods? And this relies on like robots and drones and infrared sensors so you can see the best place to irrigate and how much water it needs, the best types of soils that you can grow things the most efficiently, how far apart the crop rows should be, how you actually turn the soil, all of that. And it takes into account a lot of different things that could keep carbon in the ground as opposed to turning the soil and allow that carbon to float again up into the atmosphere. And that's just at the ground level. And then the types of food that you're growing also make a difference. And so you have this real ecosystem just based in our food supply that could be shifted to a different, carbon result. And I think that's something we need to pay more attention to. The water issue is getting a lot of attention as well. And there certainly is an energy water nexus here in the United States that we can get into. But I think the food issue takes into account a lot of these different natural resource problems and, may be able to allow us to message better too, because when maybe you pick something up and you can read about how this does help the planet, that may be something that, people, as opposed to just looking at the, Olympic athletes in the back of their Wheaties box, may be able to read a little bit about the planet. So, things like that, I think, could go a long way toward messaging and to changing the way we think about climate.
I love that. I was lucky enough a few years ago as a correspondent on the National Geographic flagship series. They rebooted Explorer, their flagship series, and I did a few stories for them that season. And one of them, I was able to go to the Netherlands and spend some time there and look at exactly what you're talking about. I went to Wageningen University, where a lot of people are doing some really innovative work on kind of the future of food. I visited a potato farmer who he's one of like McDonald's key farmers. There's like 7 or 8 in the world, but oh my gosh, he had these like amazing tractors that looked at the nitrogen content in the soil and like it was like pinpointed precision farming to get like the best potato yield you could imagine. And then we also spent time on microgreen farms and of course in the big, beautiful greenhouses of the Netherlands that I think they've had some pretty good media coverage over the past few years where they're just producing these incredible yields with such little resource because they're doing it in like a highly, highly efficient way. I think those models could definitely be and are starting to be adapted across the planet. And it's really cool because you can do it at scale in your own house. Like I have a robot garden in my kitchen where I grow pea plants and peppers and stuff. And it's all hydroponic. It just uses water. The lighting is all, I don't have to do anything. I have a black thumb and they come out perfectly. And that's a really cool way that I can be kind of involved in, I see it at my little scale for my own usage, but then also this is how we can be feeding a lot of people. And even though it's super high tech, it does seem for a lot of it comes out in the wash. They're able to do these high tech things and still keep the food affordable.
Increasingly so. And, it goes back to what we were talking about, the same thing with like solar. The more that we build market demand, the easier it is for economies of scale to kick in and, like vertical farming. David Chang's big passion there in Jersey City, which has, you wouldn't associate the largest vertical farm in the world with New Jersey and Jersey City. There it is. And, they're starting to see, some great yields and, prices are starting to come down. So that's always the kind of the rub here. How do we balance things? So geoengineering just needs its, it's going to sound corny, time to, shine in the sun. And, maybe we can come up with some great ideas that will change things at scale to make a difference.
Right. It seems like a big part of what's been missing up till now, but I think is starting to change, is like geoengineering needed a better PR firm. but I think we're starting to see that the marketing is getting a little slicker. And of course, the sexier it feels, not just to the consumer, but to the governments who might be, developing subsidies or who might be giving sort of tax incentives. And, the things that really do drive the market are the regulations. We often think of free market as having no regulation. That's not the definition of capitalism. Capitalism requires regulation. And so the kind of sexiness of these approaches, the marketability of these approaches, I think, is really what's going to catapult them into having a larger share.
Couldn't agree more. I hope that's, where we're heading. And I think, hopefully a book like Hacking Planet Earth can help add to that discussion and that dialogue. And we're starting to see some bills in Congress now that take into account geoengineering and are funding things from a research level, at least now. So it's starting to get out there. People are starting to understand that it's not just, chemtrails and, people with tinfoil hats who are
right
with these crazy ideas to manipulate how we live our lives. This is, rigorous science that goes behind a lot of these solutions. And, a lot of them don't have those negative consequences that we've discussed. They just need more of a mass buy-in. And so
absolutely,
hopefully we can promote some of that.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like we're not getting out of this without geoengineering. To whatever extent we want to utilize it, and, whether we're talking about these very kind of extreme manipulations that require all sorts of super high-tech innovation, all the way to these very low-tech, DIY things that still affect the planet, they still have a measurable effect. Without geoengineering, we can't mitigate our way out of this at this point. We've got to actually correct some of the wrongs that have been done. Right?
Not without consequence. Yeah. I mean, we just don't have time.
Right.
We don't have the luxury of time anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, gosh, Thomas, I am learning so much from your book. It's obviously right up my alley. I think a lot of the listeners to the show are super interested in these concepts as well. I'm not going to let you off the hook just yet, because I always close my episodes by asking my guests the same two big picture questions. And I'll tell you right now, the most popular answer to the first one is always climate change. It's changed a little throughout the pandemic, but one of the most popular answers to the first question I ask is always climate change. So as somebody who studies climate change, I'm definitely interested in you taking on these big picture questions. Are you game? All right. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you right now. So that could be from a very personal level to, all the way to like a cosmic level. So the first question is, what is the thing that does keep you up at night? Like the thing that you're most concerned about, maybe even pessimistic, borderline cynical about. But on the flip side of that, what are you genuinely and really authentically looking forward to? What are you optimistic about?
Yeah, well, I'm most pessimistic about, and this is more of a general comment, about the affirmation of science ignorance, and that we can ignore things and just go with anecdotal type of solutions. And that keeps me up, because that plays into, look, we don't want to act upon any of the technologies I mentioned in the book without having science to back it up. We also don't want to ignore climate change because we know that it is the one thing that we need science to be able to understand. So, when I see people, denying science and denying climate change, that really keeps me up, because that's not going to get us anywhere. The hopeful side of that is all of the things that we're talking about today. We would not have had this discussion without people thinking we are completely bonkers 13 years ago. Like we would have to define pretty much all of the terminology, all of the words that we use, kind of all the subtle meanings behind it. So we can have a discussion about climate change and people don't go, what's that? Right. So now we've gotten into this discussion. So it makes me hopeful that we'll continue on this path of enlightenment and we'll be able to solve some of these issues with our brains as opposed to just that doesn't affect me because, I'm a selfish person. So that's what I find the hope, where there's more interest, there's more buy-in, and, we're starting to see a lot more products being developed and only to continue into the future. So I think that's really exciting.
Absolutely, it is. Well, everybody, the book is Hacking Planet Earth, How Geoengineering Can Help Us Reimagine the Future. Thomas, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a delight. I learned a lot. And hey, I'm not really depressed. I'm actually really hopeful right now.
Great. Well, that was the whole point. And thanks so much for having me, and stay safe, and appreciate speaking with you. And maybe we'll speak again in the future.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.